John Soski from RICARES. RICARES is a recovery advocacy and a harm reduction organization based in Rhode Island. We work in 4 areas: peer recovery support, recovery housing, education, and policy. And we locate our mission at the intersection of recovery, social justice, and trauma, which means that a big part of what we do is address institutional and structural stigma and its consequences for people who use drugs on a daily basis. So out of this work and our RICARE's recent thinking about how to address structural stigma in Rhode Island, we've been having a set of conversations with the COBRE, one of which resulted in this recent RFP for stigma or stigma reduction research in Rhode Island. And this RFP really makes a point of emphasizing 2 aspects of stigma that we don't feel like we talk about enough. One is the intersectional character of stigma. We cannot talk about stigma against substance use disorders or stigma against people who use drugs without talking about racism, without talking about class, gender, sexuality, sex work, homelessness. The intersectional character of stigma is key. And then the other aspect of stigma we think we need to focus more is on structures of stigma. Right now, we tend to talk about stereotype or bias as stigma. That's certainly part of stigma, but we also have to address the laws, the institutions, and the broader social practices that they're part of. So how does community engaged research intersect with the conversation around stigma? We're really happy, of course, to see that there's a lot of national discussion about stigma against substance use disorders. Obviously, anyone in our field sees this as a positive development. But as a person in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction, I'm left with this feeling that there's little role for us in many of these discussions about stigma, that there's almost a paternalistic aspect to them, that there's just not enough acknowledgement that the people who face stigma on a day-to-day basis have to be the agents and leaders in transforming stigma in our society. There's too much of a sense of stigma reduction as an expert field being implemented from above. So we really think that both in challenging stigma and in researching stigma, we have to incorporate lived experiences of people who are on the front lines. And while it's useful to incorporate the lived experiences of people like me in recovery, the voices we really need to hear are people who are using drugs today, who bear the immediate brunt of discrimination and repression today, and who knows what it's like to face the challenging gauntlet of systems that claim to be helping them and are often harming them. So when we put out this RFP with the COBRE, we really wanted to encourage applicants to think deeply about what it means to do community engaged research and center the lived experience, that is the expertise of people who use drugs and people in recovery. So this is the first part of what we see as a 4-part conversation, trying to think about and deepen our understanding of what community engaged and participatory research is. Today I get to announce our next installment. On September 1st, we will be having holding a panel at 3:30 about a manifesto put out in Vancouver's downtown Lower East Side called the Research 101 Manifesto. As many people in the call will know, Vancouver is the center of Canada's overdose epidemic and also one of the world centers of harm reduction, activism, and innovation. It's also a site of extensive research and very complicated relationships sometimes between researchers and the community. In the last year, there was an extremely exciting process where a group of community organizations and younger researchers came together and put out a manifesto, basically arguing that yes, researchers and universities have one set of ethics, communities have a different set of ethical concerns, and that researchers now need to start engaging community partners in such a way that allow them things like certain kinds of ethical oversight of their research. So it's an exciting manifesto, it's a challenging manifesto, and we're bringing together 4 of the authors to talk about the process of producing it and what's come out of that experience. So the announcement for that will go out in the next couple days, but for those of you on the call, it will be September 1st at 3:30, and we'll have, and then future installments of this conversation will be announced as soon as they come together. So thank you for coming, and with that, I will turn things over to Lori.
Great. Thanks so much, John, both for that introduction as well as for all the work that you and Michelle have put into making this a reality. I personally am very excited about today because, well, I've been in the field of HIV, Hep C, substance use work for a couple of decades now. I feel like I'm often chained to my desk and don't get to engage with the community in ways that are so important. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say and to hear where this conversation goes. It's really an exciting time, I think, to do a lot of this really important work. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what the structure will be like today, we have 4 wonderful panelists who are going to start with some brief presentations. I'll introduce each of them before they speak, immediately before they speak. If you have any questions that come up during their presentations, we're going to ask that you use the chat feature if possible, and we'll try and keep track of those. And that after we've completed all 4 of the speakers, those questions will help launch the discussion. We really do want the second half of this to be interactive, to work together to discuss a lot of these issues, get ideas, maybe get some solutions. So without further ado, I think that I will begin by introducing our first panelist, who is Vivian Chavez. Vivian is a professor of public health at San Francisco State University. Her scholarship is partially informed by her standpoint as a woman of color and concerns the mind-body split characteristic of higher education. Dr. Chavez is a community organizer with media advocacy and global health experience. She is co-editor of Prevention is Primary, Community Strategies for Wellbeing, and Drop That Language, Youth Radio Stories. She produced Cultural Humility, a documentary about language, power, and privilege, which is freely available online. After completing her doctorate in community health education, she obtains a certificate of spirituality and social change from the Pacific School of Religion, studied movement-based expressive arts at the Tamalpa Institute, and became a certified yoga teacher. So let me very happily pass this over to Dr. Chavez right now.
Hi, everybody. I'm in California, and I was telling Michelle that we're having something with the electricity, where the electricity power might go off. We're having so many different things related to climate change and to the hot weather. So in case something happens, that's what's going on. Michelle and I went to school together back in the day. And it's really related to this talk for me because when I went to school, I went because I wanted to learn research. I thought that's where you learn research, and that I thought research was not only a method, but it was a culture. And so when I was there, I learned that my experience with research was really limited and very negative. And it was negative because I had come from a nonprofit that for many years worked in the community in child abuse prevention. I appreciated John's remarks because that's also an area that has quite a bit of stigma and paternalism associated, child abuse. There was a research done on communities in California in different locations, and it was ascertained by the evaluators that these programs don't work, that in fact they either don't do anything or they scare kids. So all the nonprofits, all the organizations associated with the funding, they were just cut. So for me, research was an enemy that I had to fight. Then I realized that it's because of the way they did that. They didn't partner. You know, I didn't have a research manifesto, but I definitely knew there was just something wrong when the people that are most affected, the people who are stakeholders, that they're not even asked, that they're not, that they get to find out about the research on TV or by some kind of media, but not, the researchers don't even bother to make connections or work together conjoint. And I learned that that's one way to do it, but it doesn't have to be the only way to do it. So later I was at the University of Michigan. I did a pretty exciting project to make a video about this CBPR, community-based participatory research. So in public health, we use that terminology a lot, CBPR. And there were a lot of articles about it, CBPR this or that. And I just thought, what would it be like to make a video about what does community-based participatory research look like? So the Urban Research Center that was formed by many nonprofits from Detroit, as well as the University of Michigan, the health department in Detroit, and yeah, this mosaic of people, they said they also wanted to make a video. So we partnered and we did that. And in the process, I realized that when you do something that is in community, that is community-based, you don't own it. It doesn't belong to you. So you can't really have that much control in making it the way you want to. So a lot of the ideas that I had for the video had to be toned into something that consensus, collaboration, conversation, and ways that I never would have thought about it like that, but that's what the partnership wanted. And so a lot of, we want to see what you're making, let's make it together. You need to shoot this other location. I thought I was done. So that's an aspect of community-based participatory research, that even though you might be the one that's funding it or that is more the front lines of it, it's not yours. And if you're really collaborative, you have to work together. Then I wanted to share with you a project that is the work that I did with Youth Radio, because it really made me accountable to assumptions that I had made. So by the time I worked with Youth Radio, the idea wasn't to make a book. The idea was to support them in their funding efforts, because as a person with a doctorate, you could do that. You could be an evaluator or you could be a resource for this organization. When we did not receive funding, we had gathered so much paperwork, so much documentation that we thought, let's do something with this. So many interviews and data. So we started putting together the pedagogy, the way this after-school program, youth media, youth development, very much based on youth empowerment, how they work. And I love their model. So part of my role was as an ethnographer, going in there and taking notes to see, to document the process, how they work together. And what I noticed right away is that what I assumed about working with youth was totally outdated. I used to work with young people. I used to do youth violence prevention, but by the time I worked in Youth Radio, I was 10 years teaching in college. So when you're used to teaching college students, there's a lot of compliance, a lot of classroom management that is a whole other way when you're working with young people in an after-school program that has an empowerment with adults working together. So being a part of that scene, I didn't realize, oh, that's work. It looked like they were just having fun or goofing around, or people were not paying attention. And that noticing, really, I was very interested in that, because back in the day when I was in high school, I did youth radio. So I thought I was a total insider. And that's a mistake, because I wasn't anymore. So I really had to work in collaboration with the organization and with the young people, and tone myself down as a researcher to hear what's the truth in this moment now, and what are the needs. So I want to end, and I didn't time myself, which I was planning to, but I wanted to end, so you can tell me to be done. But I really wanted to end with the concept of cultural humility, just because I think it's central to what we need to do now, when we have so many things going on, pandemic, like economic, people suffering, racial justice, so many things going on. The power could go off. So we need a lot of humility. And cultural humility has 3 components. The first one involves self-study and being aware of our biases. So from the get-go, the assumption that we are going to be biased because we lived in an incredibly discriminatory society, that we grew up in this. We don't even know where our stigmas are going to lie until they happen. And when they happen, we better be in partnership with community members so that they can help, and then we can be helpful instead of be harmful. So I think for me, the example I want to share is very much related to your work, because if a community is stigmatized, it's a people with mental illness. And one of my heroes is actually from Vancouver, Gabor Mate. He has this big, thick book where he's breaking down people who are in recovery as from child abuse experience, from economic hardship, from racism, and from, it's not just the drug addiction that you see. So I feel like, for me, ideologically, I always knew that people with mental illness are scapegoated and that there's bias. But it was not until I myself was in a bipolar support group and I could feel inside, it's not an idea, it's a feeling that I don't want to be there. I don't want to be with this community. This is my community. That's the feeling of, it's not just an idea. Those are the things when we're triggered by our biases and when we need to get help. So I think cultural humility is just one concept about the importance of self-awareness, then the partnership component, especially paying attention to power, and that there's always an imbalance, and what your position is in part of the dominant culture or part of the people who are not. And lastly, not to take things super personally, which is so difficult, but because there's institutional accountability that has to happen too. So it's not only what I can do. Yes, it starts with me, and that's why critical self-reflection and lifelong learning is so important. But also, we are connected to institutions that are in the process of transformation or dissolution. Whatever's going on, these institutions themselves have to be a part of the solution and not also contribute to the problem. So I think I'll end right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic way to kick this off. And already, at least for me, lots of thoughts that I'd like to, bounce around with you when we get to the discussion point. But our next panelist is going to be Dr. Alexandra Collins. She is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Epidemiology and Brown University School of Public Health. She received her PhD in health sciences with a focus on medical social sciences and applied anthropology from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Her community-engaged research focuses broadly on environmental influences shaping overdose experiences, documenting drug use risk environments and how they are shaped by social locations, and evaluating harm reduction interventions. Look forward to what she's going to share with us.
Thanks, Lori. So yeah, I'm a pretty recent transplant to Rhode Island. I started at Brown in February, and so I worked in all of the work I'll be talking about did take place in Vancouver. A lot of it taking place in the downtown East Side, which is the neighborhood that John was mentioning at the beginning of this talk. And the downtown East Side is about a 10-block area. And in the 80s, it was the site of one of the largest HIV epidemics in the world. And now it's one of the major epicenters of the overdose crisis. And this has really kind of led this neighborhood to be extremely over-researched in many ways. And you know, historically, research has been done in not the best of ways there. So a lot of researchers inserting themselves, doing data collection, including biospecimens, so around HIV, getting blood samples and things like that, and then leaving and not giving anything back to the community. And so this is really actually where I started learning about community-based research, was in Vancouver. I'm trained as an anthropologist. In undergrad and through my master's, my training was very much kind of traditional anthropology. You are a researcher, you are a lone researcher, you go to the field, you live somewhere for, you know, years, you do data collection by yourself. It was this very kind of traditional way of doing research, and I had never heard about community-based research at all. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started working at a HIV research center in Vancouver for a team that was doing community-based research. And this was my first kind of taste of what that meant. And I realized that the work I had just come back from Sierra Leone, where I did my master's research, that I had approached it in a bad way. I was the researcher who came in, I collected data for a question that I posed that I thought was important to understand. And I left, and I've never been back to Sierra Leone. I never took that data back to anyone. And so it was really this transition that kind of highlighted to me that there's this whole other way of doing work that's so much better and so much more important because it's rooted in the community and the community's needs. And so I entered all of this through learning about Nothing About Us Without Us. So in 2006, there was a report from, I think it was 2006, the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. And it was this really wonderful kind of introduction for me to the greater and meaningful involvement of people living with HIV/AIDS and people who use drugs. And so it was this kind of detailed document of how to engage people in work and how to do community-based research and why that's important. And so I kind of like have entered that, entered community-based research, you know, in different ways over the last 5 or 6 years. And, you know, CBR it's a spectrum. So, you know, on the one hand, on the left side, you know, it's completely researcher led, developed, you know, 100% just a researcher. And then on the right, the furthest right of the spectrum is completely community led. And so the work that I've been a part of has kind of fallen in the middle, with community involvement fluctuating throughout the project in some cases. And so I've done a lot of work around, you know, working with HIV housing providers to evaluate their service model, with HIV service organizations, again, to evaluate their programs, particularly around people who use drugs, working with sex worker unions and drug user-led unions to look at overdose prevention interventions or evictions of people. So my work has kind of spanned these areas of kind of socioeconomically marginalized folks who use drugs who are unstably housed. And I'll say that kind of all of these projects have been a big learning process for me in terms of how to do the best at engaging community while also trying to find this balance of institutional restrictions, of funding restrictions, about like timelines, and how to kind of navigate these things. And so I think, like, for me, you know, for someone who's new to community-based research, and this is something that you're interested in, I would say, like, a thing that I don't think is always kind of, I wasn't really kind of taught early on, I learned, is that it takes a lot of time. You know, there's been times I kind of was invited to come to a meeting, a community meeting. I brought up my project. I was really excited about it. I thought, you know, my topic came out of talks with other community organizations, not this one in particular. So I was like, it's in the needs of the community. Like, people are going to be pumped. Like, I asked for help kind of recruiting if they knew anyone, and I got yelled at. I got yelled at for a good while by a couple of the men there. And I took it to heart. I left. I cried on the bus ride home. I was just a mess. And it took, you know, me just stopping and realizing how had I approached that improperly, and how could I learn from that to better connect with people in the future. And, you know, it was me entering a community that has been overly researched. They didn't know who I was. You know, I didn't take that time to get to know people. I didn't go to numerous meetings. I didn't try to volunteer. I didn't take that time to build a relationship. I went in and I asked for things. And I thought, because other groups in the community were excited about it, this group would also be excited. And so I think for me, that's a really important takeaway, or kind of my advice for people who are entering CBR is, like, one, not everyone is going to want to work with you, and that's okay. You know, people's experiences with research are varied, and again, that's okay. You know, don't force anything. And also to take that time, like, be slow, be thoughtful, and learn. Like, if you mess up, one, you're probably going to get called out, and I hope community organizations always call me out on my missteps, because that's how you learn. But it's not always a kind of easy, nice process. It can get messy, and I think there are hard conversations sometimes. So just being open to that and open to that learning. And I think another really kind of important piece to CBR that we being in academia, you're not really taught, is that, like, whose knowledge counts. You know, my training, at least through school, is that you study topics for years, you leave with a fancy degree, you've got letters after your name, you're an expert. You're not an expert. A degree does not make you an expert. It does not, you know, I've studied overdose prevention sites and women's overdose risk. I'm not an expert in those things. I don't have that lived experience. I'm not a frontline worker. And I think that when you're doing good research, we as people from academia need to enter these kind of relationships, realizing that we are not experts in anything, and that the knowledge that counts, the expertise that counts, are from folks in recovery, folks who are using drugs, folks who are, you know, giving those services on the front line. It's that lived experience and that up close and personal kind of interactions. That's where the expertise lies. And as researchers who want to do community-based research, I view it as, you know, you're a researcher at some part of that, but you're also an activist, and you need to make space for the right voices. So folks, you know, with lived experience who are in the community, for those voices to be heard, and to engage in what the community is saying. If that's, you know, policy change, if it's, you know, fighting at different levels in government, it's whatever. But I think that just trying to reframe this idea of knowledge and expertise, and understanding that, you know, you can have 20 degrees and that doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's that lived experience that really matters. And I think, especially right now, for, you know, I dealt with this a lot in my PhD work. You know, I started my PhD right at the height of the overdose crisis in Vancouver in 2016. You know, it was declared a public health emergency like 3 months before I started school, and my whole project was focused on drug use and became focused on overdose risk. And I had to figure out how to balance community engagement when people were dealing and are dealing with death on a daily basis. And that is not an easy thing. It was a lot of being nimble, realizing that the perfect plan that you have mapped out with people is not going to be the case. And, you know, to figure out just how much you can engage people ethically. You know, I worked, all of the projects that I've worked on have, we had peer researchers who co-led or did the data collection themselves. These are folks from the community with either currently using drugs or had a history of sex work or drug use or you know, housing instability. And it was also a learning process. We had never done this kind of work with folks from the community in the middle of a crisis. And so I encourage people to, one, hire folks to do this kind of work. Peer researchers are unbelievably talented and ask such better questions than I could ever ask. But you have to be flexible and you have to work with folks, you know, taking time off for them to have space to grieve and to heal, be nimble with this project, with your project needs, and have very open lines of communication is really important. But I just, especially now with dual epidemics and community folks are stretched incredibly thin, be mindful when you're engaging people. You know, be thoughtful about how much you're asking, do the heavy lifting, do that hard piece, and offer things, you know, offer your services, offer to help, just don't, yeah, just be very careful of, you know, not putting even more stuff on people's plates. And so I think having those open, kind of strong relationships and open lines of communication are really important. I also don't know how many minutes I've talked. This is something I could talk about for ages. So if it's been about 10 minutes, I'll stop.
We're at about that point. So I think we could probably pick a lot of this up during the discussion. I know for one, this whole idea of being a researcher versus an activist is something that we grapple with a lot. I would love to see how others juggle that hat. But let's turn it over now. I'm going to introduce Sarah Ziegenhorn. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. She is a nationally recognized harm reduction expert and the founder of the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition, a community-based organization working to highlight injustices and eliminate health inequities faced by people who use and inject drugs. Sarah has worked with people who use drugs for nearly a decade, including with the Washington, D.C. Syringe Services Program, HIPS. Before founding IHRC, she was the special assistant to the president and research associate with the Washington, D.C. health policy think tank, the Institute of Medicine. Sarah received a bachelor's degree from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota in geography and community health. She is currently an MD candidate at the University of Iowa Carver School of Medicine, where she conducts ethnographic research on drug use and pregnancy and researches health outcomes associated with incarceration. Sarah is a native Iowan, dividing her childhood between Iowa City and her family's farm along the Mississippi River. She lives in Iowa City and Seattle with her dog, Callie, now.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be speaking with all of you today. So I think I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit briefly about my experience and then talk from the experience of someone who has worn a lot of different hats, but primarily be talking as someone who has led a community-based organization and fielded many interactions with researchers as sort of a go-between between community members who are the targets of a research study or the ideal group to be engaged by researchers, and then the researchers themselves or a similar like-minded body. But so just to briefly introduce or expand on that introduction, I have some academic research experience of my own, and so working in a number of different research settings, and with some CBPR training that I developed over the course of my education. And then obviously with medical training underway, experience working in academia in different ways. But also have spent primarily most of my time over the last 4 years serving as the founder and director of a community-based harm reduction program that started in a state that did not have harm reduction organizations, did not have harm reduction programs, but grew into an underground needle exchange that was serving up to about 50,000 people a year across the state in multiple communities. But then also, one thing I do not often talk about, especially in settings like these, is my own lived experience. And so have been in recovery from opioid use for quite some time, and had a partner who founded the organization, Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition, with me, who passed away from an overdose about 2 years ago now. So lots of sort of different touch points at which I enter into this conversation with different experiences. But so I want to start by just telling 2 quick stories about sort of a time when working with researchers coming into community went really well, and then a story about times when that went really, really badly, and then pull out some sort of themes and key takeaways from those 2 stories about things that I think are really helpful from the community organization standpoint for consideration. So a few years ago in Iowa, especially with the influx of federal dollars to state public health departments, and influx of funds to researchers from many different places, our state health department decided that rather than use their funds to invest in community solutions, to invest in harm reduction approaches, that they would primarily invest those dollars in doing needs assessments and research from treatment centers, and give the money to folks in academia to do their own evaluations. And so they've been sort of engaged in this never-ending process of needs assessments rather than using their funds. Like, for example, there are some folks on the call from Missouri I see who have used their funds to do incredible things that have had really wonderful outcomes and involved sort of mass distribution of Narcan. But so what this led to in Iowa was sort of all of a sudden a community of researchers who really did not have much experience working in the community setting, or very much experience working directly with people who use drugs, being encouraged to go after these new pools of money, and then to take that and go into community and use their expertise to transform our world and our lives. And so what that started out as in one particular experience is a group of researchers sort of inviting folks from our program to come in and spend a lot of time meeting with them and talking about their ideas for their research project, and then requesting to spend time at our organization. And so especially because at the time we were the only group doing sustained harm reduction work in the state, we were sort of bombarded by researchers. And so at one point, I think I listed over 40 active requests that we had. And at the time, the folks in our program were working sometimes 100, or on average, usually between 80 to 100 hours a week. And so we were stretched very, very thin. We had almost no funding. And so most of us were getting paid, if you average it out, like less than $3 an hour, but we're just exhausted. And so the constant requests sort of kept coming, but I think without sort of a mindfulness for how intense of a burden it was on our staff and on us as folks trying to do needle exchange, Narcan distribution, and to be out in the community, but to get this sort of never-ending series of requests to be coming to the university for different meetings and connecting with folks. And so we had in the first story I'll tell, we had a group that came to our office. And so we started inviting people to try to come into our setting to get a feel for sort of how they reacted when they engaged with our participants, especially during our drop-in hours. So what was sort of their general vibe like? And we would put people to work. And so we always said, we'll meet with you. We have drop-in hours during this time. Please schedule maybe 2 hours that you can hang out with us. You're going to you're going to pack kits of cotton filters for safe injection. You're going to pack some Narcan kits, and we'll talk with you while you're there if nothing comes up. And so a lot of people took that as sort of a sign of rudeness, of being inappropriate to say, why would I do work like this? I have a PhD, I have a lot of skill. Why would I waste my time with this kind of rudimentary activity? But for us, it served a really important purpose. And so in the particular example that didn't go quite well, we had a group of researchers come and spent a long time sort of in that setting, asking a lot of questions that were really oriented less around their own research process and what they wanted to do with participants, but more around their amazement at our site and our setting. So sort of questions like of the people working there, who were a lot of younger folks, questions like, do your parents know what you do? Do your parents feel safe with you working in this place? And for a group of people who are in recovery, especially a group of people who had just lost one of their coworkers and they're very close friends to an overdose. So of course, that's a very insulting question to be, asked, especially for a group of people in their 40s too. Do your parents know what you do? And so those sorts of dynamics, though, became really important for sort of eliciting information about what researchers were going to be worth spending time with and investing in from our perspective, but more importantly, who could inflict some kind of harm on our participants, or that could not ruin, but damage the relationship and the trust that we had with our participants if we were to act as the intermediary of doing the introductions between participants and that group of researchers. And so often what came up in those discussions too was this, and it's been referenced by other folks too, but was the idea of expertise. And what that often looked like was the researchers and folks giving us a long explanation about the work that was happening in Vancouver, or work that they had read about that was going on in Chicago or Missouri. And in fact, we were very close with folks in all of those communities and had sort of very good ties and friendships with those researchers. But there was this assumption that we would have no knowledge about those people or those places because we were not the experts at all, but just this like rinky-dink community group trying to get by with our scrappy, HIV prevention on a $0 budget project. And so the other thing that came up too in those conversations was this tension between what is the value of research versus what is the value of the engagement with the immediate needs of our participants and people who use drugs on a day-to-day basis. And so for the researchers, there was this sense that like, if we can get to your participants, we will get this data that will transform everything. And suddenly policymakers will see the data and they will just they'll realize the solutions and they will enact change and everything will be perfect. But for our staff and our participants who had been doing a lot of really sustained multi-year engagement directly with policymakers and with legislators and writing bills ourselves, even as groups of our clients / participants and staff, we had a very clear understanding of how that policy change process worked and the weight that politicians in our state put on data and evidence, especially in a very red state. But most importantly, for our clients, that kind of investment in that very long-term structural or systems level change process just frankly wasn't important, because on a day-to-day basis, their greatest needs were figuring out where to sleep for the day, what to eat for the day, how to get money for the day, and how to get well, or how to get whatever else that someone might need in a short period of time. So our staff too were very much engaged in making sure we could get through that daily survival process, but oftentimes any indication on our staff or clients' end of being engaged in that came as a sign as a lack of professionalism or messiness or disorganization or other types of signs that in a professional or academic world could discount the possibility that we might have knowledge or expertise to contribute. So for example, one time I was on a call with a research group talking with this researcher about the planned project and the process. And I was in our office and we were short-staffed that day and we had an overdose in our bathroom. And so I put myself on mute for most of the call, but kept taking the call and kept talking and participating in the conversation while I was giving CPR and administering Narcan, but didn't say anything like, oh, I need to hop off the call, I have an emergency, because I knew that in that particular world that would indicate or like create some kind of alarm and significant discomfort that would be seen as a lack of professionalism rather than operating within this very different context in a community where people were just engaged in trying to survive. So in an example though, so kind of conversely where things did go very well, we had a researcher come to us and she was really frank and really clear that she didn't know anything about the topic area. She was really upfront that there was all this new funding and that she was being pressured and encouraged to go after this funding by her peers, but that she was very interested in the work we were doing. And so we recommended to her a list of readings. And so she did all the readings and we told her there's a bunch of conferences coming up. Here's some webinars. Maybe you might want to go to these. And she did it. And so then we said, why don't you start coming into our office on a weekly basis and packing Narcan kits and just chatting with our clients? And so she did it. And so over time, she was able to start building relationships of her own with clients and with our staff just by spending time in this space. And that obviously, it seems very simple and it's also very textbook CBPR, spend time investing in building trust. But almost, it seems like 100% of the time, I understand how folks in academia can get extremely busy and it's really difficult to convince a funder that you need to build in time into your research timeline to basically be doing nothing, which is just hanging out. But it is, especially for folks who don't come from anthropology training or ethnography, where that kind of process is key to your fieldwork. But in this process where she did invest a lot of time and did spend this time getting to know folks, it transferred a lot of the workload off of our staff, which in a community organization is oftentimes invisible, but involves the staff being the ones who are doing sort of all of the managing of the relationship building and the facilitation of bringing people into the research process, which is often a huge amount of time involved and labor for which the staff don't have time and are certainly not compensated. But she began to develop her own relationships in which she could mediate that process. And most importantly, she did allow for the clients to have some agency in shaping her research questions and the way in which she was developing her process. So most importantly, she let the clients dictate or the participants dictate the way in which law enforcement would be engaged in her project and how and if law enforcement would have access to her data, which was something that was very important to other researchers in these other settings, was that they could share their data readily with law enforcement. But for our clients was a big no-no and an absolutely not. And so with this sort of investment in the sort of shifted sense of power and how the research was developed, it also became something that became very valuable to the participants in the process of engagement rather than just the opportunity to get a stipend or get $100 for doing an interview with her, because the relationship itself to the participants became important, and that process in the participation of planning became something that was empowering and added value to their general experience of being a human who is appreciated and seen as an expert in the world. And that in and of itself was something that people named as important to them and why they participated in the research, which typically in the other settings was just about the opportunity to get some cash, even if they felt like they were generally harmed by participation from this sort of experience of stigma from the researchers that they engaged with. I have other sort of themes to talk about and pull out from those, but I think I too forgot to start my timer when I started talking. So I will pause there because I think it's been a little over 10, and then just wait for the discussion time to talk a little bit more. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I can't even express how much I love this idea of vetting researchers by bringing them into your setting to help too, and to be able to have those discussions in that way. I'm in awe of the beauty of the simplicity of that, but how telling it probably really is, as you're showing. So next up, our final panelist is Dennis Baylor, who is a person in long-term recovery. He's the Overdose Prevention Program Director at Project Weber Renew and the co-chair of the cross-cutting work group on racial equity of the Governor's Overdose Prevention Task Force of Rhode Island. For the last 6 years, he has worked as a peer recovery specialist, community outreach worker, and an HIV test counselor. And I hear that he can put up tents and take them down very quickly. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Well, first I want to thank John Sosky and Michelle McKenzie for asking me to join in on the conversation. You know, when I was first asked to join in, my first thoughts were, what do I know about research? I don't know anything about research. I never worked in research, never, don't have the degrees to follow through with that. But as I began to think about it and speak to my director and John and Michelle, I realized that working here in this nonprofit organization that I do, where our peers that we work with, people who are involved in male sex work, female sex work, HIV positive individuals, transgender individuals, opioid use disorder, all kinds of substance use disorder. I realized that, you know, research, we're a hot ticket for research, right? You know, so maybe I do know a little bit about research because they different individuals trying to collect information and data do engage with us. They want to speak to our peers or our clients about their lives, trying to get information. So I have experienced positive as well as negative interactions with researchers who are just trying to, you know, collect information. Again, as I mentioned, you know, what we do, like some of my experiences kind of mirror what Sarah was discussing. And again, I do like that idea of having the researcher participate in that work, because we do needle exchange and all the harm reduction services that are needed out here and with the individuals that we work with. You know, we just want to see people stay alive, right? That's the bottom line. We want people to live. You know, we believe in harm reduction. We also believe in treatment and recovery. We know that it's possible. But I can think of positive interactions with researchers. I'm going to just throw out a couple names. Brandon Marshall, person that comes to mind. Him and his team have come in. They support us financially. And they also get involved personally. I think what last year's Pride Parade, Brandon let us use his driveway to build our float. So there's a researcher who doesn't mind getting involved, doesn't mind really helping out and being a part of the organization and the work that we do. So it can be a good thing. I like some of the things that Alexandra said in regards to the experts. I've also experienced some researchers who come in and, they kind of come with this attitude of the white coat and they have all the knowledge and all the information. Fact of the matter is, if they knew so much, they wouldn't be asking us for information. They would be coming in and trying to talk to our clients. It's the person with that lived experience who's actually the expert. Me, I'm a Black man in recovery, used for a lot of years, and of course, it's only since I've been working with this organization that I realized that my lived life experience is something that unless you live it, you have no idea what it's like. And that type of thing applies to the peers that we work with, that we try to assist. That life that we live out there. I mean, I don't mind telling you, I've been homeless. I have childhood trauma that I can address. I've been to all of the dual diagnosis facilities, and speaking purely honest, because that's what I do best. I lost my children to DCYF. That's stuff that a researcher can only dream about and understanding. But I understand that firsthand, and I appreciate the people who come into an organization and allow the people with the lived experience to be the experts, because no doubt about it, we are. I am the expert. And I don't say that obviously just to try to pump myself up. It's just the fact. We who are out here on the streets doing the outreach, because we have 2 vans. We outreach multiple shifts a day, trying to engage with individuals who are out there just suffering. They don't let on to that, but we know they're suffering, and only a person who understands that suffering can oftentimes get that individual to really open up, to really provide information which is just invaluable in regards to the lifestyles that we find ourselves living. And when I speak about my clients, the people that I work with, I always say we, because I'm one of them. I just happen to be one who was able to step away and make some changes in my life, but make no mistake about it. We out there with the opioid substance use disorders, the alcoholism, face a lot of stigma. And again, I can relate. I'm trying to think what else I can say. I don't know if I have 10 minutes of talk, but again, research is valuable. There's no doubt about it. The data, being on now I find myself on the Governance Overdose Prevention Task Force, being a co-chair of the Racial Equity Work Group. Data is what, of course, can change things. Oftentimes get the funding to flow. So research is definitely important, and I realize that these days. But it does need to be done in a proper way. It does need to be done so that the experts can really have a say in the information. I kind of just lost my chain of thought, so I think I'll stop with that and wait for further discussion to begin. But thank you for allowing me to speak here for you.
Great, thank you so much, Dennis. That was wonderful, and I think brings together the theme that everybody has spoken about. Clearly, community engagement is about making the connections, but the connections are very personal ones. And as we all know, developing personal relationships does take the time. One of the questions that I want to start with, but then obviously want to open it up to the group, is we're all coming into those relationships with a history. It's the history of our own history, the history of the researchers whose shadows we're working in, of the organization's histories. How do you reconcile all of that when you walk into a new relationship, knowing that you've had colleagues who perhaps things haven't gone as well with, or clients who have really been burned in the past? How do you start in those delicate situations? Anybody who wants to take that one?
I can speak to it because I'm new to Rhode Island, and you know, I haven't done this type of work in the U.S. before. And I mean, for me, I'm just trying to be super open. I share all information about myself. I try to be very forthcoming, and I just want the transparency. I want folks to know my background, that, you know, I'm still learning too. I've done this type of work, but I'm not perfect. And I definitely have so much to learn on how to do this type of work and to do it better. So I think it's just reaching out and trying to make yourself available, and just be very forthcoming about kind of your positionality. You know, I try to say pretty early on, you know, don't have lived experience in these things, because in the past, you know, that's why I've gotten yelled at in some instances too, is, you know, why do I get to do this work when I don't use drugs? And so I think it's pretty important to just be as open as possible with people. And then that sets it up for, you know, gives community organizations a good frame of like, no, we're good, thanks. Or, you know, like, okay, maybe you can come back, or just something, versus being like, I don't know. So I just come with like trying to be pretty open, how I came to this, why I'm here. And hopefully that's, you know, people will either think that's a good thing, or, you know, I'm not the right person, or I need to learn from that a bit more.
Great. Any of our other panelists want to build on that? Or
I want to share a project that I did recently, and I ended up actually not doing because I don't think that research was the necessary thing. I was allowed or invited to participate more as an observer, as a person who could be a witness, support. It was an expressive arts organization, and I had gone through their training program. When I was introduced in my bio, it said about movement-based expressive arts. So it's a therapy and social justice-based organization. They do great work. I went through the program to learn the techniques so I could be a better teacher in the classroom, because I know that there's other ways than lecture, through movement, through creativity and art. But when I was in the organization, I didn't realize how personal, what amount of going through the program isn't just about taking and learning things, but it's about opening up myself and being vulnerable. And so I let 10 years go by, and I thought I'll go back to the organization because they're very open to me. I've also served on their board of directors, and they're very open for me to be in their, that I'm not an instructor, but I wasn't really a researcher. I wasn't getting anything. I was more helping to document the process and being there for support of the participants. And when I really saw what their program involves, and I saw the level of confidentiality, the level of, I think that story, Sarah, that you shared about going to the bathroom and having to be on the call, that you have to split yourself from being like really honest about, look what's going on. So I feel like I got a sense of seeing, oh, that's how the program works. People really, we, because I went through the program, we spill our guts. Like we really, go through the healing process, there's a lot of work, but it's not to be told. So I decided not to write about that. And I'm in a position that I have focused more on teaching than on research. So that's something, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but it's in realizing when research is not needed.
And I think that that's probably a real challenge for career researchers who, as one of you eloquently said, are often trying to go into things with preconceived questions and agendas. So to be able to step back from that, given your own institutional constraints as well, or funding constraints, becomes the challenge. And it's making me think that people probably need to work on the development of these relationships well in advance of then trying to propose the research. We're putting the cart before the horse so frequently. If this is a direction that folks are going to take, that we're all going to encourage, I think it's a shift of mindset for how we do things, even within the constraints of funding institutions, career value, etc. So I feel like we can use the raise hand function, but folks are also willing to, if folks are willing to unmute, we can probably go a little more free flowing in that manner. If
Lori,
please.
sorry, I have two thoughts on what you just said. One comes from when I was a researcher before I crossed the mirror into this weird space that we labeled the community. I really thought I was an activist, community engaged researcher, and in some respects I was. But to be honest in the way Alex is talking about, you really have to know your own motivations. And that's actually harder to do than it says. Or it's like harder to do than to say. And I spent a lot of time in my research reacting out trauma in terms of what I thought was solidarity with people who I was researching, but in fact was self-serving and ultimately very, very damaging to them, because I wasn't at a space with my trauma, my past, my addiction, my abuse history, to be honest with myself about why I was there. So it's like, yes, we need to show up and be honest, but actually that's a deep problem, really, really challenging. As somebody who now deals with this primarily from the point of view of a community organization, I want to say that what I'm fundamentally interested is in community-led and community-empowered research. And I think what you said is exactly right. I'm tired of people showing up on my doorsteps with grants half written or already written, trying to slot me in and my organization in and the people I work with in because we're a funding requirement, right? Like if you want to work with us, really the point at which to start is at the very beginning of conceptualizing your project to ask us what do you need, what kind of research do you want to participate in, and what are you going to get out of this. So I think the language of community engagement and community participation, the agency and framework in that language is still centered on academics. What's it going to take to actually recenter the entire conversation on the expertise and agency, not just of community organizations, but community themselves? And I guess that's a final thing I will say. It's very slippery and very useful for academics and also especially for governmental departments to treat our organizations as if we are the community. We're part of the community, we represent segments of the community, but our organizations have their own interests, their own composition, as you asked, their own history. And so if we really mean community engaged and empowered, that should go beyond engaging particular community organizations. That elision between community organization and community as a space where a lot of power dynamics get enacted.
Can I add one thing to that? I think one point I have seen that is, I think, quite important is in thinking about who is the community and who is the target. I think there is one important place where researchers do have the opportunity to add a lot of value and expertise, and that is in training around analysis of structural determinants and particularly power analyses. And so one thing I often see happen is in which people label the community as just simply anybody that's ever put a needle in their arm or anybody that's ever gone to treatment. And so you can access that community in a jail, in a treatment center, in a 12-step group, at a needle exchange. But I think what's critical is knowing how to engage your own expertise and your own training background with the content and the discussion that you hear from participants. And so, for example, I saw one researcher was only recruiting participants from an inpatient rehab center where most folks there were committed to doing 30 days because they were court ordered to be there. And so in his process, he said, I engage this group, they help me define the research questions, but the research questions that came out were very, very, very different. And the content that emerged was striking because it was all about how, like, without the police, I would never achieve sobriety. Jail and prison are critical to my health, and I can't be well without those structures. And so without having any kind of lens for like a fuller evaluation of where along a continuum of systems am I reaching people, and where in my own training do I understand how in which people react and respond to power being exerted. How do I navigate and sort out and pull out sort of what is being said to me and what is being defined as my question or my participants' comments that is shaped and shifted by those structures. Hopefully that makes sense.
And I think also makes a lot of sense depending on the type of research that's being conducted. So I'm thinking some of this fits in really well with ethnography, anthropology, things like that. When we have quantitative researchers, there's a role for that too, but that's when we often fall into the evaluation versus research question too. So I'm thinking now from both clients of community agencies and folks that want to do what John referred to as sort of community, for members of communities, which is not a single thing, how do they go about, without a research partner to start with, to begin to find research partners to help to get their own agendas moved forward too? If that question makes any sense. Sort of coming at it from the other end, I feel like we've sort of thinking about both agencies being approached by researchers almost for the purpose of finding members of quote unquote the community, but why does it have to go that direction, I think is also what we're saying. That's a little more difficult. And one of our thoughts when putting this RFA out was for us to help liaise, make that connection, and to find researchers who can help support those efforts. I'm not sure exactly what the question in that is, but how can researchers make themselves more available to some of those questions?
I think I think picking up on what Sarah was saying about the limitations of time, I think that's really the challenge in terms of community-based organizations, and researchers will come to us and often have sort of ideas, beginnings of ideas that will either be in line or not be in line with what we would research if we sort of had unlimited time. And there's a sense of sort of going along with that, because I think there's just such limitations of time. You're so in the day-to-day that you at least us, I can only speak for us as an organization, we definitely struggle with sort of taking the space to say, okay, in an ideal world, if we had a researcher at our disposal, what would we want to research? When there are researchers around us who in general are doing wonderful work. And so we sort of just, we go along with them because they've got this expertise and we believe that they're true partners of ours. But if we were to have unlimited time and sort of have unlimited resources, would we do something different? Probably we would. So that I can only just speak on behalf of us in terms of our work and how challenging it is for us to just make it through every day and keep all of our staff alive and try and keep our folks alive. It's a struggle.
I want to let folks know that, as Lori had suggested, that there is a call for proposals for research that is community engaged and specifically addresses stigma. John had referenced it as well. And I'm putting the link to that in the chat. So if folks are interested in, so certainly researchers, but also community groups who have ideas, and Colleen, I completely appreciate what you're saying, that it's like when you're every day trying to get all the work done that you need to get done, that it's difficult to sort of pull back and say, wait, where do we need the data? Where do we need these questions answered? That's hard. I think we need a retreat. We talked about this before. We need a retreat, some time to pull away from it. But I just posted the RFP. So if anybody is interested, either researchers who are on or anybody, community groups who have ideas, we can work to try to connect if you don't have researchers, particularly that you know who is working. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, for doing that. And I think that also sort of leads to, so here we are, we're this Center of Biobehavioral Research Excellence on opioid and overdose, but our core specifically, which was deemed the special populations core, but really aren't all population special. I feel like one of the things we're really aiming for is to figure out how to make those connections and how to see that biobehavioral research excellence really lives within communities, within people with lived experiences, and how can we bridge these gaps and really be activists for all of you within the research world for the work that's being done in communities. So I don't know if anybody has any, I'm trying to follow the chat box too, but I think that was just Michelle's that popped up. Has any specific questions for our, for any of our panelists, or if anybody wanted to sort of continue beyond their allotted 10 minutes originally. I know that Sarah, you had mentioned a couple of other themes that some of your anecdotes you could expand on from some of your anecdotes. Not to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I will, maybe while waiting for people to put in some questions, I will add on. I think a lot of stuff we have covered just in talking and moving through this. And so I think in terms of like, how do you go out and build that relationship? How does that start and what do you do? I think some of the critical first step is recognizing, right, that you don't need an organization. You don't have to have this place that you're going to. You literally could just go out onto the street and do what harm reductionists everywhere do, which is, and outreach workers do, which is just like go out and meet people and build relationships organically from just hanging out outside and in spaces where people in your community spend their time. So like places where you procure food and meals, and places where you procure a place to sleep for the night. Like all of those are spaces that theoretically are open to anyone. And obviously knowing how to navigate and negotiate those spaces is where people could theoretically run into some trouble and cause harm. But I think the sort of like key part of starting out on that is sort of remembering this commitment to the language that we use, and that it's so elementary and sort of constantly, I feel like people are just limiting stigma reduction to just simply, oh, if we only just change our language, then we're good, no more stigma. But it is so, so important. And it's so easy, I think, to watch folks who have had some kind of training in especially public health research or healthcare systems research get really caught up and stuck in language that's really rooted in diagnoses or public health jargon about vulnerability and marginalization and specialness and populations themselves. And so in this project one researcher had done with our organization, it was a storytelling process, and what came out in most of the stories and in a separate research project as well, is that people were really pushing back against the language that they had been met with. And so like the content of the stories, it didn't even get into things that could be talked about in terms of like, what are our policy solutions? What changes do we make? People were just so caught up in like how they felt harmed, or not harmed, but triggered by the language that had been used in sort of the initial negotiation of the research project, because it was all about like your addiction. Let's understand your mental illness. Let's understand your substance use disorders. And people were just like clamoring to be like, please don't understand these as just diagnoses. Like I'm a person with lots of things going on around me, and I want people to accept that all of these things are behaviors and not my core identity, and that these diagnoses carry incredible amounts of stigma. So I think that's, yeah, a helpful place to start, is just coming in from this place of like really thoughtful and considered mirrored language of what people around you are using, but like refraining from application of those sort of loaded and coded terms.
I wanted, because you opened the door to language, I'm very moved in this time when there's a call for people to speak out and to not be silent. And it's interesting for me that silence speaks, but I hadn't thought about it in the way that it's being framed in this particular moment. I was thinking of an evaluation that I did where the community organizations, it was violence prevention programs with Latino and Vietnamese youth. And then there were the definitions of Latino would mean Central American, new immigrants, and Vietnamese. And so the research put these boundaries on with language so that they could have better data. And then the Vietnamese said, if I have a Cambodian friend, I'm going to put them in the data. It just doesn't make sense. And the Central American said, you know, like there's so many hybrid people who are all kinds of Latinos. And so the community organizations, when I did the interviews with them, they were very forthcoming around this. But when we sat around the table with the funding source was actually the health department. The health department was paying me, and the health department was paying the community organizations for working on this project. And the health department had a SAMHSA grant, Substance Abuse Prevention and Mental Health grant. And the SAMHSA grant had timelines. And the ways that the community organizations spoke around the table when the funder was present was so different when they spoke to me privately. They didn't say the things that they had told me. and that I had told the health department that, you know, you need a lot more time. You need to fight with your granting, with SAMHSA people. You need to do this, and this. And they said, but when we are in the room with the community organizations, they don't say that. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, silence speaks. You're paying them. Of course, they're not going to say that, because they think that that's wrong, that they're doing something wrong. So I just can't emphasize how much language matters. And yeah, I'll just leave it like that.
But I think you're also getting at, and one of you spoke about this earlier, the power imbalance that is perceived by people and given context. And does the person who's in a perceived position of power need to open that door for the openness, for the honesty, to try and equalize and take the power, to minimize the power dynamic to the extent possible in situations like that? Because it's only until those walls come down that the information is truly shared, really. But again, another easier said than done, because it goes back to my comment about history walking in with all of us on many levels. And a very basic language matters thing too. A lot of the research that many of us are involved in is funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which actually would take an act of Congress to change the name of. So, from the top down, language matters.
I also want to talk about, for researchers as well, you have to it's academia itself is a really messed up institution that likes to exclude everybody. So I think when you do community-based research, like my previous organization, at one point had 5 peer researchers that worked with us. And even that naming folks, not just researchers or research associates, but having to put the peer in front of it, and fighting organizations around how you pay people. All of the folks that I've worked with have been on disability or social assistance, and making that switch to full time is not a reasonable thing, because people have health issues that come up and then they'll lose out on everything. So it takes a lot of academics need to step up and fight these really archaic bureaucratic systems that do criminal record checks and say you can't use drugs and you can't do this, that, and the other, because the best folks I've worked with currently use drugs, came to work, did amazing research, and it was great. Nothing happened. So you have to find these workarounds. And so for us, that was until we got flagged by the financial office, we would pay people out of our petty cash, and we would pay stipends under the table, and that didn't mess up people's social or disability or social assistance checks. It gave people, they didn't have to wait 2 weeks, because people were living day to day trying to just meet basic needs. So I think it's also it is work, but people who want, academics who want to do this, you have to be ready to fight kind of your institutions, because they do want to keep certain folks out, and they do want to keep these very old systems in place, and they want to make it hard for people to access this grand ivory tower through funding constraints. So it's definitely not easy. I haven't tried, I'm new to Brown, so we'll see how frustrating that is at an Ivy League institution, but it is a process. And I think that academics need to do that and to make that space inside institutions as well. And figure out ways around these hiring processes that are in place, and write in grants, money for organizations, write in, funding for extra money for stipends, and use that to pay folks from the community, like figure out how far you can push stuff and just keep pushing it until it changes, is kind of, yeah, my 2 cents for researchers.
Thanks, Alex. That's great. And I think brings up a big point. I think that researchers who are budgeting for things are so used to being very specific that the idea of maybe just a bigger pot of money going to a place is okay in a way to do something so that it gets into the control of agencies to use in the way that they feel can best support their programs to then be able to work collaboratively. I don't know if, Dennis, you have any thoughts on that, or I see you nodding, so.
Yeah, I'm nodding, yes, because I don't run the organization. So I don't want to claim to know a lot about how the funding will work. But again, I just being honest. But one thing is for sure. I know that there are restraints that I know that there are restraints in regards to what you were talking about as far as the research and the funding that puts handcuffs on some organizations to do the work the way it needs to be done, and to be able to build stuff without getting themselves in trouble by whatever. Again, I certainly don't know a lot about that. My director, Colleen, and people like Sarah, who actually run the organizations, they can certainly address that better than I can. But yeah, so that's not quite my
Definitely not. I didn't want to put you on the spot. Just sort of thinking about more autonomy and again, being an expert, but also being an expert on what needs are to be able to get your work done, both on an agency level and on an individual level. So no, thank you for your comment.
Well, thank you for asking anyways. Thank you.
I just wanted to just jump in and say that the autonomy piece of it, I think, is really important, because I think oftentimes people want to fund specific things, and so they want to fund sort of a person, and that person, for example, like Dennis, could be fully funded already. And so they want to fund, sorry, somebody's mowing their lawn outside. They want to fund specific things, and really the freedom that we can have as an organization is to be able to fund the things that nobody really wants to fund. And so as a researcher who comes into the organization and says, what do you need? And it's like, well, we need insurance for our van, or we need, the specific cotton for the, we need these random things that nobody really wants to fund. We don't really need $5,000 for Dennis's position, which is 4,000, funded millions of times over. We really need these more specific things. And that's a challenge, I think, talking with researchers about those kind of things, that we need this flexible funding. We don't need this specific funding.
Yep. Thank you. That's helpful. And I think builds on, what Alex was saying about pushing the envelope a little bit on institutional policies too. Not that I'm going to advocate for that, but working within those constraints creatively. I do see a question in the chat from Lauren Green. How do you maintain trust among community members when the research data papers do not create change hoped for, or when ultimately the decisions of what to do with the research doesn't fall in your hands, but within the larger political powers?
I guess struggling with our group specifically, we have a lot of community partnerships that we've built. And I always want to be very careful about when we're asking and soliciting for suggestions and collecting all this data, being mindful that we can take this and we can propose it back to the systems that could make the change, but they haven't done it in the past. And so while we want to do it, balancing that, not destroying that trust of the community by false promising what change can actually be made. And I think that's where we've sometimes struggled.
I have one thought of this that builds on something Alex already said, which is, I think on the community side, there's a lot of realism about how long, how hard, how bitter, and how fragile change is. Like, you know, any promises are almost discrediting from the beginning because we've seen it and gotten like fucked over and kicked in the face so many times. I think the real test for researchers in terms of trust are, do they come back? Are they there for one project? And sometimes that's okay. They come in and say, we're here for one project. This is what we can give you. It's, you know, it's an exchange, right? And that's clear and everybody knows it in advance and it's fine. But if one wants to talk about a deeper level of trust, are they going to come back after that project? Are they going to come back and engage with your organization even when they don't get funding? I mean, Colleen and I have talked about this a lot. What we have in Rhode Island that's so extraordinary, Brandon's group, Liz Samuels, is researchers that whether they have funding or not, come back and work with and give to our organizations. And we know that as long as they're in Rhode Island, they're going to be working with us. And so that to me is the real test. Is this a drop in and drop out extractive relationship? Or is this a long-term commitment to continue to be present within the community when it's valuable financially and when it's not convenient and you have nothing to get from it except to the reward of being present and being part of something?
And I actually think that James's question piggybacks on that. She's looking for advice and ways that we can use our research to be of service to individuals and organizations. I don't know, Jen, are you still on?
Am I on? Yes.
Oh, okay. If you want to sort of expand on that question.
Sure. No, I'm happy to. Yeah, I so appreciate this idea of not being drop in, drop out researchers. And I think that's the first step, right, is being there. But I really feel like I talk to people I'm in these community organizations and I talk about what I want to happen, but I know, and I try to make it clear that that's, years down the road, right? It takes a long time to get anywhere. And I'm just trying to see, are there things that are useful, skills that we have that we should be offering, and how do we are there best practices for starting those conversations, for saying, these are the things I can offer, these are the things I can't offer, this is, at what point did that happen? Does it happen after the relationship's established? Is it the first meeting we attend? I don't know. I'm just so wary of not wanting to do anything to promote distrust or to damage a relationship, but also wanting to be of service in some way. But I sort of don't know what I should be putting on the table.
Jen, I really like your question. It makes me think about like the big heading, entering the community. The idea of like, how do you enter a relationship? You don't begin by just saying, I could do this, I could do that, I could offer this or that, or like it seems kind of weird or over eager. Also, you don't come in by saying everything that you want. So how to do it? I like the idea of being invited. So is there a way that, for me, invitation is everything, because it's already that you have a trust there. For example, being asked to speak and for your community is because Michelle invited me. Michelle, I have trust there. So I knew, well, she must think that I have something to offer. And I know who she is, and I know her commitments and her values, and I can imagine the people that she works with. So this idea of invitation is so precious to me. Why I imagine for Alex, when you're coming into Providence at Brown, it must be difficult because you're so you're so fresh, new. So you need a lot of invitations. And part of that, I think this pandemic, and we can never forget, we are in a crisis of all social relationships are disturbed by this new way of relating to one another. And the natural ways that humans can can organically be friendly and reciprocal and say, oh, I do this, you do that. Just the more humanistic, human ways are being, it's not just that they're challenged, but they're totally disrupted. So, but somehow I do think that this idea of not imposing yourself, but also finding ways of invitation could be something.
Yeah, I think like for me, John and Colleen are on the call. So if I've done a terrible job as I've entered Vancouver, please tell me. But like I had some, I had some connections through Brandon Marshall. I work in his lab, but for other people and kind of in general, I just sent a lot of emails and just like, hi, I'm new. Like, can I come by? Like, I do harm reduction work. Like, it'd be great to understand what's going on. And cause no one can invite me if they don't know I'm here. And so I just tried to be friendly and just literally just like, hi, I'm new here. Like, can you help me like learn about stuff in Rhode Island and how can I be of help or what are the questions here? And so I think like to Jen's comment, like research is super slow. And I think like, you know, you put a grant in June and like maybe in a year and a half, you can start on it. But like what happens in that meantime? And I don't think that, and again, this has been kind of touched on by a lot of people on this call, is like, you can't just drop in, oh, let's develop this grant. I'll get back to you a year and a half if it gets funded. But it's just being present. I think showing up to meetings, staying in touch, like with phone calls or, you know, checking in, asking if there's something that, you know, maybe you could do, like, you know, maybe there's a fundraising campaign happening and you can help support it, or you can do, you know, I don't know, help with like Colleen said and Sarah said, like, just go to the organizations. And yeah, like the pandemic has made some of that a little more challenging, but I think you can still have those like conversations. And I just think being very, I don't know, being very open and just honest, and just showing up and just ask. Yeah, just ask. People know what they need. Organizations know exactly what they need. And you know, hopefully there's a way you can make that work. But I would, yeah, just try to show up.
I would second what Alex said, because I'm just thinking about the number of researchers that have worked with us and have gone on to do a GoFundMe for our organization. And then they go and one researcher designed t-shirts, sold the t-shirts, sent the proceeds to the organization. We have, you know, researchers that they know how to do certain things. So we're doing the International Overdose Awareness Day. Alex said, well, could we do the data entry for all of your WUFU? Those are just like kind of things that they can do that can help us. And so I think it's really like, what skills do you have that you can offer to an organization that maybe, and then the humbling part, I think what Sarah talked about, which is super important, is to say, you know, to be humble and to say, if it means gathering clothing and bringing them to the organization, dropping things off, physically doing things that I'm not used to doing, do that, because you're going to gain so much respect from that organization. You're not necessarily going to be seen as this person who's just, like John said, in this extractive relationship. It's more of a sort of, I want to be useful to you. What do you need? And we've had so many researchers that have come to say, and they really mean it. And we say, well, we really only need this one weird thing, and it's kind of below yours. And they just say, oh, I'll do it. And they do. And that's the beginning of a relationship, a real relationship based on sort of equal respect.
Yeah, the example that Dennis gave too of building the float in Brandon's driveway. That's real. Sarah, was that you that I interrupted? I feel like I interrupted.
I was just going to add on to what Colleen said and say, like, the fundraising piece is like, I know that it sounds very like tit for tat, you know, I'll help you, you'll help me, but it's just another one of the sort of signals or ways of signposting, like, I'm here, I'm committed, I'm engaged with you. And I think researchers forget that, like, you do have access to pockets of people with a lot more wealth than many people engaged in our organizations may. And so any kind of engagement in helping with basic fundraising activities like that is a huge symbol to our organizations of commitment and investment. And that cheerleading is really important, even if the money you raise is quite small. The other thing I wanted to add is, like, I often find researchers will come to us and be like, I've got tons of skills, let me help you. I know how to write, I'll grant write. I know how to do data analysis, I'll do your data analysis. And like, we oftentimes, like, we're fine with that, you know, like, we're subject matter experts in our work. We know how to write grants. We know how to do this other work. And oftentimes, like, training other people to write grants about our subject matter is extraordinarily difficult because grant writing requires so much knowledge about the inner workings of our programs. But what is actually helpful is sort of being a translator in really difficult power dynamics and roles that are complicated. And I can't remember who brought this up, but this is sort of a role that I see that a lot of times folks in research don't have. And so they really want to be helpful with creation of policy change. But that requires having really good points of contact and relationship with people who are either elected officials or just, if not more importantly, with people who work within state agencies and have autonomy over decision making around how dollars are spent, or in county or municipal agencies for the same purpose. And so, like, for example, when I go and say in public that drug users in Iowa don't want to go anywhere near the health department because they associate it with being arrested, the health department can come and say, you know, the needle exchange is scaring people away from us. They're the ones telling drug users that we're evil. When in fact, if some intermediary voice is able to do that kind of speaking to the and be the power broker in that space, it can be hugely helpful for that sort of like moderation role in relationships where power is really complicated.
I believe that's what a recovery coach or recovery support specialist is perfect for, is that role. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera on, but I feel like that's the pivotal point, is the power differential between the community agency and the researchers, and then above and above and above. There's something in transition there. There's something that to me, until except for the last few years, there's been something missing. The smooth transition, and I know transition can be hard for anyone really, but as a person in recovery, anyone, and I mean anyone, that had any type of power differential from me, I wanted nothing to do with. So to have the person, the recovery coach, the recovery support specialist, stand there and just look you in the eye, and they know because your experience is not exactly like theirs, but it's like theirs. And that levels the playing field. That's your transition. That's your, I'm going to call it, we're your walkie-talkie per se between. And that's why I find the recovery support specialist role so important, because it's the missing link in my eyes.
And I'd like to pick up something that Bethany just said, which is like, where are the academics openly in recovery? Where are the academics who talk about their drug use? It's like I look at Brown University, and of course I know from meetings that this is not true, but there's no one, I don't know a single academic who's publicly in recovery or publicly talks about their drug use in the entire state of Rhode Island. So, you know, why like, we're out there taking that risk every day, and many of you have tenure, and you know, that is a powerful kind of allyship.
I think part of that differential too is perception. I know that some of the folks that of our folks, when in meetings and work groups with researchers, they feel really deficient because their perception is that these research folks have so much brain power. There's just, what can I possibly offer? And anything I say, I'm afraid is just going to sound stupid to them. That's a real perception. And so the notion of being the actual human being that you are will go a long way to breaking down that barrier and to communication and that perception of the power imbalance.
Thank you. So we're nearing 5 o'clock now. So I want to just take a couple of final moments to, first of all, thank our incredible panelists for sharing your time and yourselves with us. Claps to all. This was really great. I think it was a wonderful open discussion, a fantastic way to kick off this series of panel discussions and webinars. So thank you also to Michelle and John for doing that, and to the COBRE for the support to be able to do this. We hope that we'll be able to continue these discussions. The next one will be on September 1st at 3:30 with the Vancouver Manifesto, which is, I'm sure, going to provide a really interesting discussion. And I think from the chat that we may have gotten a preview of what's coming up after that as well. So let this, be just one other step to moving things ahead in a positive, productive, open, honest, respectful way for everyone. So thanks to all for spending this time with us today.